Hi everybody, I'm Becky Annunzio, and my lesson is on consent, particularly what does consent look, feel, and sound like. And so the learning segment description is going to be a lesson for 9th graders in the co-ed setting. The idea is for them to understand what is consent, understand if there's different kinds of consent, when do we need consent, and is consent only for sex? And so this segment will be following a lesson that we already covered, consent laws. They watched a couple videos about consent, and I've linked those in the bottom, the last slide for y'all in case you want to watch them. And so in this activity, students are going to brainstorm verbal and nonverbal consent and verbal and nonverbal dissent or non-consent. They'll be able to identify other times when consent may be necessary. And this is going to be a formative exercise prior to creating an infographic flyer that they'll display throughout the school to advocate for health-enhancing behaviors within our school community. The standards we're going to be covering are Standard 1 and Standard 4, and so students will comprehend concepts related to health promotion and disease prevention to enhance health. The other standard is students will demonstrate the ability to use interpersonal communication skills to enhance health and avoid or reduce health risks. The 3 lesson objectives I feel they'll be able to do by the end of the lesson is students will be able to identify at least 3 types of consent during a small group discussion. They'll also students will be able to list at least 5 examples per consent category when we're doing our brainstorm activity. And students will be able to predict at least 3 situations other than sexual activity where consent might be necessary. And again, all of these will be completed by the end of the lesson. My presentation objective is to speak slowly and clearly during this video because I tend to talk fast. So my intro will be about a minute. I will reinforce and reintroduce the concept of consent during sexual activity. I'll remind them that we discussed the laws in the previous class, that consent is necessary every time for all sexual activity, even with one significant other. And then the previous lesson that we went through had videos on consent, and I'll remind them of that we had just gone over all of this the day before. The developmental activity will be about 8 minutes. It's a brainstorm activity about verbal and nonverbal consent and dissent, and so it'll be done on the whiteboard or the board. And I'll list 4 categories: verbal consent, nonverbal consent, verbal dissent, and then nonverbal dissent. And then I'm going to ask the students to create a list of what each category sounds, looks, and feels like. And so students, depending on how you prefer it, I tend to just like them to call it out at me, or you can call on students individually. And I'm going to elicit responses for them to give examples for each specific category. The teacher can write it on the board, or you can assign a student to write it on the board, or you can assign a student per category, whatever you prefer. And then you'll make an inclusive list for each category. And so on the next slide, I have an example of what it might look like. So as you can see, like under verbal consent, it might be something like they'd hear, yes, keep going, don't stop, I like this. Under nonverbal consent, the person might be initiating, the person might pull you in closer, they might be undressing, they might move your hand to a particular private part of their body. And then verbal dissent would be no, stop, I don't like that, I'm not ready, I'm not sure, can we slow down? And then nonverbal dissent might be something like pulling away, crying, being drunk or high, being under the age of 17, pushing you away or trying to get away from you, turning their head like if we're doing kissing and things like that. And then in the lower quadrant there, I specify that if any of the nonverbal dissent cues are there, that they must stop and they must check in for verbal consent. If their person is drunk or passed out or high, they need to stop and ensure that their partner that they're with at that time is safe, and that that they need to take care of their partner first and foremost, and we shouldn't advance with any sexual activity. And so the conclusion will be about a minute. And so I would ask the students if they can think of any other times outside of sexual activity that a person may need to use or understand consent. Some of the responses might be something like for a medical procedure, or even going in and hugging a friend, taking or borrowing someone's, items. Like those might be times that they could see where consent would be necessary. I would then either myself or have a student take a picture of the brainstorm activity like we just did, and then I would post that in Google Classroom as material for the sex ed unit. So they can always have that and refer back to that and see what it's like, see what it should look like or sound like. And then I'll let them know that tomorrow's activity is going to be that this brainstorm was the foundation for students creating their own infographic flyer to be hung throughout our school community that will help to promote healthy behaviors within our school community. And I have an example of something like this on the next slide. And so this is something we've actually done before. And so the different levels of verbal consent and then verbal non-consent. This student that made this flyer indicated that it must be sober and of sound mind. Consent can be revoked at any time and cannot be forced. And so, they had all the little thought bubbles or the speaking bubbles over here, right? And so I really thought that this was one of the much better examples of work. And so we have several of these hanging throughout our school. We've got different versions of it, other students work too, but this is definitely one of my faves. These are some of the resources I use regarding consent laws, types of consent, Illinois, sex laws and consent laws, and then, the book. And again, on this last slide here, I've linked you the 2 videos that I've used in class for consent. They're quick and they're cheeky, and one of them uses the F word, so buyer beware. You might not want to watch it with your children in the background, but they're really good examples and quick, fun, lighthearted ways to talk about consent where it really makes it simple to understand. I hope you enjoyed my lesson, and I look forward to continuing this semester with y'all. Bye, everybody.